Okay, so welcome to the whole student. Catering to students' wellbeing in school is just as important as their academic progress. Academic progress and wellbeing go hand in hand to deliver the best student learning outcomes. Find out how student-led inquiry targets that does not make sense to me. I'm so sorry, I'm going to say that bit again. Find out how student-led inquiry targets student engagement and achievement and keeps them social and informed. So I'd like to welcome Daniel Green to the stage. He's from St. Peter's College, and he's going to take you through how the college incorporates multiple areas of the curriculum within a student-led inquiry. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Belle. I'm excited to be here today to present to you the work that we've been doing at St. Peter's College at our Clyde North campus. We've got an alternative Year 9 program there. Last year was our inaugural year, so it's still quite a fluid program, still a work in development, but I'm hoping that I can share some of our experiences with you here today, and hopefully you can take away something. One thing that resonated with me in Adam's talk this morning was that's really important to start with the why and not the what. And I was glad that I decided to go that way today as well. And I wanted to start in terms of why we think that this particular approach to learning, when I refer to developing 21st century learners through inquiry, is important. So the following information that you can see on the screen comes from the Foundation for Young Australians. And I'm not sure if anyone's ever had an opportunity to view some of the articles that they've published recently, but there's some really good statistics and information there that's worth sharing with your students. It's really relevant in terms of where they see the workplace going and some of the information there. So as you can sort of see there in the infograph, automation, globalisation and collaboration are the three key drivers changing our workplaces currently, and they see them being quite large contributing factors to the workplace going forward as well. So we can see that that's having a change in what those workplaces are looking like. Now, not to say that this is what all workplaces and all industries are going to look like in the future, but we're already seeing a shift to some of these types of workplaces built around teams, collaboration, opportunities for people to go away, work independently, bring that back to the group as well. So they're very open, very flexible, and we're seeing more and more of these spaces, workplaces, appear, and we foresee these being more prevalent in the future as well. So it's important that we take note of this and that we are mindful of these things as educators. One of the main contributing factors to students transitioning into full-time work is enterprise skills. Now, in the context of our program, we refer to them as 21st century skills, but for the purpose of the Foundation of Young Australians, they refer to them as enterprise skills. So we're talking about the same thing if you're maybe wondering, well, how come they're switching between the two? So they are referring to the same, and the research showed that students with enterprise skills transitions into full-time work up to 17 months faster than those students that haven't had exposure to those skills. So we're seeing that there are some particular enterprise skills that are in high demand in the industry at the moment, and some of these percentages are a lot higher now because you can see this data is from 2012 to 2015. So we're seeing that some of these percentages are even greater now, but digital literacy, critical thinking, creativity, are definitely the ones that are in the most demand for workplaces at the moment. These are the skills that they want people coming into the workplace, so young people entering the workforce, to have. In our Year 9 Expand program, we adapted a model from the World Economic Forum, and we've adapted that. Some of the skills here are relatively unchanged, but some of them have been tweaked a little bit just to suit the purpose and context of our school. So we can see that there's a reliance on literacies, competencies and qualities to develop a 21st century lifelong learner. And I know Adam touched on that lifelong learning this morning as well. So we're not going to go into too much detail about how we try to target each of these skills, but you will see some of these icons appear throughout the presentation to give you an idea of where we thought students were being exposed to these skills and having the opportunity to use or develop them. So if you see some of these icons, we might come back to them at the very end of the presentation as well. So that gives you a bit of context as to why we're doing this. We've seen that changing priority in the workplace and that need for students to be developing and being exposed to 21st century skills. So how do we go about this? How do we go about meeting this? What I'm going to, I suppose, share with you today is not just, is just, I suppose, one element of what we use to address the why, as in by no means the only way to go about it, but we found it to be quite effective when we looked at the learning that occurred within our cohort. So we mainly looked at three things that we wanted to focus on in terms of how we could develop those 21st century skills. So we looked at interdisciplinary inquiry, which is part of the focus of today, and project-based learning. We wanted to really expose our students to deep and rich learning that was authentic, so relevant to their lives, what's happening in their world. So we try to not use the terms of real world, because they are in the real world, it's their world. How can we draw that context into the classroom? The next point was flexible and dynamic learning spaces. Giving students a lot of choice and freedom to select different workspaces within the building to best suit their needs. Sometimes they might require to run a team meeting and a particular conference room, or some of the lounges or the circular tables best fit the purpose or priorities for that group at that time, where sometimes areas which allowed for a little bit more independence or quiet work was more beneficial for them. So providing that flexible and dynamic learning space really gave students the scope to explore and design and create. And then lastly, providing a framework for them to follow. We were really conscious that we couldn't go too big too quick, and that we needed to scaffold the students along their journey. And part of that was by implementing the design thinking process. And that was just a way to give students a framework to guide their design and really help them along problem solving and coming to a solution. And you'll notice that this will be quite a focus in today's presentation. So I just wanted to share with you how we went about incorporating a student-led inquiry at our school. I'm not going to touch on this for too long, and how we incorporated those things that we mentioned in terms of those three hows. So our inquiry for students was, how can I communicate the impact of bushfires to a specific audience? And you can see those icons here of where we found students were having access to develop those skills. But some of the considerations and constraints that we put in place had to be team orientated. We really wanted to see social interaction, collaboration, communication, and so it was important that they were working within a team. We also were conscious that we wanted students to work with people they might not necessarily have had the opportunity to work with before. So teams had to be mixed gender. They had to contain students from different core classes so that they had the opportunity to work with people that might have different opinions to them or different views to them, to really hopefully ask a lot of questions and really deepen their understanding of what they were talking about. Students had a target audience. That's where we brought in another constraint. Rather than just saying, how can you communicate to a specific audience? Well, what is their audience? So I've put one example up there, but there were a range of different audiences, and students had the option to choose the audience that they wanted to target. So the demographics were age-related as well as location-related. So they would have an age group living in a particular area. So you can see one example there is young adults living in Emerald, so a high-risk area. Sometimes we might have had secondary school students in Melbourne, which is a very low-risk fire area. But then how do you communicate that information to that specific group? There were particular goal setting and team meeting scaffolding. So teams had to facilitate a team meeting once a week. We provided them with some templates and flowcharts to run effective team meetings. But that was just a means for helping students identify what their long-term goal was and set smaller goals in terms of working towards achieving that large goal. The financial literacy was a bit of an afterthought at the time, and it really became a key focus for a lot of students, and was one of the key things that a lot of students took out from the task. And there was the financial literacy sort of underpinned the task, and was related to students renting out workspaces for the day. They also gathered income for attending particular masterclasses which we ran, and I'll speak about those in a moment. They also could receive fines for breaking particular rules. They also had the option to play around with savings accounts and earning interest so that they could buy bigger and better learning spaces for the next day, which might have had access to whiteboard tables or couches instead of having to use the chairs. So they had to start thinking about those types of things and how they were going to best spend their finances. And then we move on to some scaffolding differentiating to help them through that. Each group received a teacher mentor. And that was really important just for having a go-to person for that group, somebody to check in to see how they were going and be involved in the goal setting. So each day they would set a daily goal that would help them achieve their long-term goal. And then the teacher would have to essentially sign off on that goal and check in with them at the end of the day to see how they went in achieving that goal. They also facilitated assessment interviews with the group at the end, which we'll talk about soon as well, and were pivotal for assessing the productivity and effort of the group each day. So each group would be categorised into needs to get going, going or go-getters, and then depending on what category they were allocated to in terms of their work the previous day, gave them special privileges for the next day. So if a group was in the go-getters, they had first preference to selecting learning spaces for the next day. Working spaces, there was a lot of choice for where they could work, and they got to select a new space every day. They were priced accordingly, as I mentioned before. And it was really important for providing different spaces for different learning needs. So we had a quiet area where groups could go to work if they wanted to get out of the sort of main area which most groups congregated towards, that they could go away and have a quiet space. If they really had a clear focus for the day that they really wanted to accomplish, they could go towards a quieter space, or there was conference rooms that they could hire as well. We were also conscious that we needed students to have particular skills and knowledge along the way. We delivered those through masterclasses, and we managed those through the try booking, which you'd be familiar with for this particular conference. We embedded that within Schoolbox, so students could go on, they could see what masterclasses were running, at what times, what they were, and then they could select on that particular class and say, I want to go and learn a little bit more about this, or our group's having a bit of trouble with this, let's go and get some more information. And then they could buy a ticket to that particular class. And then that master class would be running at a certain particular point of the day, and then they would opt into that. Probably a good opportunity to mention that for this to work, we had to have a flexible timetable. So we were lucky that we had the whole Year 9 cohort in the one building. So what we did is we just blocked out the whole timetable, and students were given particular times to go and independently work within their group, go and have inquiry time, as we referred to it, go and work within their groups, and then if they wanted to opt into a masterclass, they could do that. And there's other things running throughout the day that they could choose to, arrange or organise their time around. So to give you some ideas of some of the master classes, we had compulsory ones which students had to go to at some point, and they were available multiple times. So they were things like running effective team meetings, finding reliable sources of information. Then they had we had optional ones as well. So not all master classes might be relevant for all teams. So things like managing and dealing with conflict, running effective team meetings. Not all teams might have needed that, so they were optional classes that allowed for that little bit of differentiating depending on what groups needed. And then the curriculum and assessment. I know that was part of the intro in terms of multiple areas of the curriculum, and I'll show you what sort of curriculum strands that we targeted for this particular task. But a large part of our focus was having authentic feedback. And so with this particular unit being focused on bushfires, we actually had our local CFA come down, and the firefighters were able to provide authentic feedback to the students. They have that expertise and really criticise the work that the kids had done, ask them really meaningful questions such as, have you thought about this? Or give them some more sort of context as to what it really is like on the front lines. That occurred during the prototype stage. So you'll get a better idea later in this session of when that occurs. but this particular feedback would be really essential probably at any stage of the design process. But define or ideate would work very well for authentic feedback as well. But we went with the prototype stage so that they could present a number of prototypes and then using the feedback to determine which one they wanted to go with in terms of their final product. I touched on that assessment interview before. So teams had to have their assessment through a interview with their mentor teacher, which took approximately one period for us, which is an hour. Students were able to self-assess prior to coming to that interview on a descriptive rubric, which was designed from the work of Patrick Griffin, if anyone's aware, from the Assessment for Teaching. So it's very clear as to what students had to show, make, write or do at each stage of the progression. And students could self-assess themselves. Although they worked as a team, each student was assessed individually. And when they came to the meeting, they had to bring in evidence to support why they put themselves at that point in the progression. Teachers obviously use descriptive observations as well to make those judgments, as well as the evidence that the students provided to provide an overall assessment for those students. And then we obviously covered multiple areas of the curriculum. So to give you an idea, these were what we targeted initially. We didn't want to go too big too soon. This was our first go at this inquiry, but we've already identified other areas of the curriculum that we could bring in and expand upon. So we see we covered areas of humanities, English, science, mathematics, physical education, and being a Catholic school, religious education as well. As I said, there's a number of other areas, and this doesn't really necessarily just apply for bushfires. There are a number of other contexts that you could do this as well. One area that we've identified is for our next inquiry is Melbourne as a livable city, and we've already identified a few areas of the curriculum that we can bring in and link to that inquiry. So going to go through now with you the design thinking process, which was that framework that I mentioned. And I said before at the beginning of this session, I really wanted you to be able to take away something. This framework was something that really helped us implement this inquiry and found was from the feedback from students through surveys and observations, they found this quite beneficial. Now this is from the work of David M. Kelly, but it has evolved a lot over time, and the particular design thinking process that we're looking at today is from Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. Now if anybody's after any resources to this model, the design thinking process, you can head to the Hasso-Plattner website. There's a really great resource there, an introduction to design thinking process, and it gives you a rundown of the what, why and how for each of those 5 stages. So not only what needs to be done, but how to do it and why it's important. So we found that to be a really valuable resource. So the first stage of the design thinking process is empathize. So before you can start, you need to understand the people within the context of the challenge or the problem. Now, for our particular activity today, and you can probably see that it's going to get hands-on very soon, it might not necessarily apply as it should because it's been tweaked a little bit to fit within the time parameters. But it's all about students empathising and putting themselves in the shoes of other people for who they're solving this problem for. It does work really good from a business model, but it adapts very, very well for an education point of view as well. From there, once they collect that initial information, it's about making sense of what the problem is and then going about defining it and how they can use that initial information to learn a step forward or define that problem so that it's that first step towards the solution. So how are they going to approach this within that context that they're working within? Once they have that, and once they know their clear direction of what they need to do, it's about generating ideas after that. And we really encourage students just to not find the right idea straight away. It's not about finding the best idea, it's about just generating as many ideas as you can. And that was one thing that they found quite difficult to begin with, because they just try to find the solution straight away. But it's just about generating as many different ideas as possible. And one that really works quite well is the worst possible idea. So thinking about what's the worst thing you could do to try to solve this problem, what wouldn't you do? And that can really generate a lot of interesting discussions about how they go forward. The 1 + 1 = 3 model is a really good one too that students really engage with. Then from there, it's about creating something tangible that the user can interact with. Now, doesn't necessarily always have to be physical, can be in a digital context. Being in the VR, AR session earlier today would be something that would be a really good prototype to develop. But it's just having something that the user can interact with so they can, that the students can then understand, well, what impact has that prototype had on solving our initial solution, initial challenge. And then the last stage is the test. And as you can see, it's about collecting feedback, how well they went about meeting, or that prototype went about meeting the solution, meeting the problem to the solution. And so it's about assessing the quality of that idea and that prototype. So once they do reach that stage, they do, not necessarily once they reach the test stage, but it is a very fluid process that they can move between the stages at any given time. They can, from the test, realise, okay, the information we collected in the Empathize stage probably wasn't, we probably didn't have enough information. We need to go back there and we need to reconnect with our user and we need to collect some more information. Or maybe we didn't define the problem well enough and we lost track, we lost sight of what we were trying to achieve. So they can move between the stages, and it's not necessarily one way. So we really try to encourage with our students that it is about trying different things, and failing is okay because it just brings you a step forward to the solution, or another step forward to success. So we really encourage that, that willingness to have a go and not be afraid to fail. So what did we find? So we've looked at the why and the how. So what did we find that we had by the end? Now, this is not necessarily always the case, but some things that we developed, and it probably wasn't true for every single student within the cohort. But we found that by and large, students were able to work independently and collaborative towards a shared goal. They really valued that process of learning because they could see the development and the stages that they went through to get to that solution and to solve the problem. And we're exposed to those 21st century skills for lifelong learning that we had at the beginning. So now I want to give you an opportunity to actually dive into the design thinking process and have a go for yourself, and hopefully really see the different way that you can approach complex problems. Now, I don't really have a complex problem for you today because we don't have the time to, but what we're going to do, and it is a bit of a spin on the spaghetti and marshmallow, but you're going to have a go at constructing the tallest possible freestanding tower that must support a single marshmallow at its highest point using only sheets of paper. And you only actually have 20 sheets of paper, unless we counted wrong and one team got too many or too less. But if that's the case, let us know. You've also been given a piece of butcher's paper and a marker. And what you're going to do, in a moment you'll see that I'm going to go through each stage, and you'll see that there's actually a time limit for each stage. Now, for this particular Empathize stage, you can use any resource that you have available to you. So you might want to jump on the internet, collect any information you can. Once that 5 minutes is done, you cannot use a device. So devices will be prohibited. So you have to collect any research and information within this 5 minutes. Then after that, that is the only information you can use going forward. Okay? So no cheating. The last thing I want to mention is that we need ideally teams of 4. And there should be hopefully enough, if we've got the exact numbers that I was told, there should hopefully be enough. We do have to have 2 groups per table because we weren't able to separate the tables. So if you can, try to make a team of 4. 5 would be okay, but we definitely don't want to go any more than 5. So try to make up a team. I'll give you 1 minute to form your team. It might actually be worth, if I can, having somebody write that down, because I didn't have room on each slide to add that statement, our problem statement. So if we maybe got someone take a picture, or although that might defeat that whole no no device element, but maybe write that down on the on the page. That's what we're trying to achieve. And then in a minute or so, I'll start the timer. I've put up particular prompts with each of the stages to give you some guidelines and hopefully some methods of how you tackle each stage. Okay, is there any groups that don't have this problem statement written down somewhere or somewhere for reference? Last chance to grab it. Okay, so we're going to start at Empathize Stage. Remember, you've only got 5 minutes to collect any research you want that you believe will help you reach and solve that problem. So just a reminder, anything that you want to refer back to later needs to be written down on your butcher's paper. Okay, everybody, that brings our time to a close for the Empathize stage. So if I could get all devices away. Okay, for the next stage, which is define, you now need to use the information that you've collected to start to think about how that's going to impact on your process of coming to a solution. So I'll put some questions up there, or some sentence starters, to give you an idea of what you might do in this stage. Now, I can already see some groups that are already starting to try to prototype and see if things work. One thing that we try to remind our students of is that it is a process, and we really try to constrain students to working just on that particular stage. It is really important, and we've engaged with a program recently at one of the tech schools. I'm not sure if any other people here have had the opportunity to engage with a tech school, but they really try to make the lines between each stage very, very clear, and then not moving on to the next stage until we have really developed a good foundation in the previous stage. Once we get to the end, then we can move between. So you're going to have 5 minutes now to define the problem and think about some of those points on there, and how they might impact on your design. We are running a bit over time, so we're actually going to shorten this stage. We're only going to make it 2 minutes because we're going to run out of time otherwise, so I apologise. I thought I timed it pretty well, but so we're going to go for up to minute 3, and then we'll move on to ideate. We did start a bit late. Okay, sorry about the shortened time, but we'll move on to the ideate stage now, which is where we just try to generate as many ideas of solving this problem. Okay, I'm really putting the pressure on you. The joys of being after lunch. So we're going to the prototype stage, and I had intended to give you a fair bit of time for this stage, but I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Maybe 4 minutes. 4 minutes. I'll show you at the end if you like. Yeah, there's a way of embedding a video. Yeah, so that's a YouTube video. I was trying to find another way of embedding it as can, but that was the only way I could do it. It was done purposely. For no reason. Okay, so that brings us to the test stage, and might get Belle and Ren to help us out. But I did want to emphasise how important the define stage is in relation to working out how best to tackle the solution and what we need to think about. So just as a bit of a gag, I guess, but I brought in these giant campfire marshmallows because it's probably not what people would have pictured. So just as something to think about, and would be something to probably talk about with your students, is that they need to think about, well, what size is the marshmallow? How heavy is it? What kind of paper are we working with? So these would be things that would be just defined at that stage, or explained at that stage. If anyone wants to see if their tower can support one of these, you're free to have one, but I do have normal sized marshmallows as well. Okay, everybody, I better wrap up before I get kicked off stage. Again, I apologise that we didn't quite run to time and that we had to cut that back a little bit. Hopefully it was still enough time though to give you enough exposure to the design thinking process and how each stage is really pivotal to breaking down complex challenges to create a solution. So I'll just leave you with a few things there and reviewing the process. Did you define the problem adequately? Did we consider that giant marshmallow? How did your definition impact on the product that you produced? And if you had more time, what would you do next? So hopefully this maybe gave you an idea of how it might change your approach to a complex challenge, and that's okay. That's all right. I figured that would happen. So I thank everybody for their participation and engagement today. Hopefully you got something out of it. I'm not sure how much time we have for questions. We might have a couple. So if anybody has any quick questions, yell out. I think there's a microphone that's going to come around. But I will hang around afterwards if anybody wants to pick my brain on anything else. I think we've got one over here. I think we've got one down here.
G'day, Daniel. My question, is around how do you support disengaged students who, I guess this obviously relies on developing those independent skills, but there are always going to be people who don't buy in. And what are some strategies that you utilise to help them?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And as I mentioned before, it's not the silver bullet. You're always going to have, you're never always going to hit 100% of the students in terms of that level and engagement. But we did find that there was a real sense of ownership of the learning because they were working in that team. They did feel like they had that responsibility to engage with that learning. It comes back to, I suppose, some of those scaffolding techniques, and part of it was having student choice. And we found that having student choice played a large factor in them engaging with the inquiry. We probably found, we ran this over about 4 weeks, although there were a few interruptions, so it wasn't quite 4 weeks, but we probably found that this would maybe work really well in a 3-week sort of period. So keeping it maybe short and kind of quite intense would probably maybe help with engagement as well, so they're not getting to a point where it's all right, kind of ready to move on now. And yeah, so I think just having a lot of student choice, a lot of options available for students of to be able to focus on different target audience. We had a group of boys, to give you an example, that we'd found were quite disengaged, but they had a real keen interest in four-wheel driving. And so one of the target groups, we made a separate target group for them, which was four-wheel drivers in, I think it was the Grampians or the Great Dividing Range, something like that. So that became their target group because they had a real interest and passion for that particular topic. So just trying to tap into that interest. And because they were working in quite dynamic groups, we had that option to do that. Yeah, and tailor it for specific groups as well.
How deliberate are you with the structure of the group and who goes into which group?
Yeah, great question. We did give them full freedom to choose who they wanted to work, as long as it was within those parameters of having a multi-gender group with students from different core groups. At the very, very beginning, they had to undergo a group audition to see if they were able to, if they passed that, they were able to stay together as a group. I suppose by no means is that something to really indicate whether they will work well within a group, but we're all about them being taking ownership of their choices, and if they choose to work with certain people, dealing with and managing the consequences of whether that is maybe not a great person to work with. If it's, say, a friend that's going to constantly distract them, then we're trying to get them to learn from their choices and make better decisions next time. Yeah. One more. We might make that the last one, and then if anyone who has any questions, I'll remain behind.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm just wondering if you defined any roles within the group, and whether you found that helpful or not.
Defined roles, did you say? Sorry? Team roles?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was part of the... I didn't elaborate on that, but during those team meetings that I spoke about before, where they had one per term, they had to assign team roles and who was going to complete what, or who was going to take ownership of what task and what time frame they had to complete that task within. So that was all up to them to decide who was going to do what and when they were hoping to have that done by. Yep. Cool. All right. Thank you very much again, and if anyone has any more questions, I'll hang back. Thank you again.